Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So here I am on Horse Guards Parade in London, and behind me is a statue of Earl Mountbatten of Burma. And it's right beside where his funeral procession took place in September 1979. Curiously enough, he was killed 5 days before I was born. He was on his yacht Shadow V at Mullaghmore off the west coast of Ireland when his yacht was blown up by the Provision IRA. So people came to rescue him, and he was still alive in the water. His legs had been blown off, but he succumbed to exsanguination just a few minutes later. And there were a few other civilians on the boat with him, at least 2 of whom were killed, one of whom was a 15-year-old Irish child. So that was that. So who was Lord Mountbatten, and why did the IRA consider it so important to kill a 79-year-old civilian who'd long since retired from the British Armed Forces? Well, Mountbatten was born here in London in 1900, and his surname was actually Battenberg because he was a partly German origin. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria. So his father was in the Royal Navy and was ennobled as the Marquis of Milford Haven. Milford Haven being a port on the west coast of Wales. The Royal Navy used to use at the time. The Royal Navy's only got 3 naval bases these days, but remember, it was the largest navy in the world at the time. There was double power standard, as big as the 2nd biggest and the 3rd biggest navy put together. So anyway, he later went to this Royal Naval College as a cadet when he was 12, and he was not exempted from onerous duties or stern discipline on account of his regal ancestry. And he had one elder brother, so he was commissioned into the Royal Navy. He passed out from Dartmouth, that Royal Naval College which still exists. I think he spent some time at Greenwich as well, which is a Royal Naval College into the 1990s. It's here in London on the south bank of the Thames. And then he went to Cambridge just after the First World War. I don't recall which college. He was slightly involved in the Cambridge Union Societies and the debating society, but he went down after a year without a degree. He wasn't an academic sort, and in those days it was quite common for royalty, and it was on the edge of royalty, to go to university for a year or 2 and not to sit in the exams, not to take a degree. And there are other undergraduates who went there with little intention of graduating and would quite often leave without a degree. They weren't sent down, they didn't fail, but they wanted a little bit of education. They weren't very fussed about formal qualifications. Remember, most people had no academic qualifications at all at the time. Most people were leaving school at the age of 14. So to have any experience of university meant you were much more highly educated than the man on the street. So he continued his Royal Naval career. He was very close to his cousin, the future King Edward VIII. His cousin at the time was the Prince of Wales. And indeed, in the early 1920s, they went on a worldwide tour, including India. Obviously it was the British Raj at the time. You can read Lord Mountbatten's diaries for it, and landing in Mumbai, then called Bombay, and the non-cooperation movement was in full swing. And so the Congress Party, they urged people not to greet the Prince of Wales as he arrived, as he went through the gateway of India. And so the British government, and indeed the government of India, as in British controlled, mused about this. Should the Prince of Wales land at Bombay or not? Go through the gateway of India, that huge ceremonial arch in downtown Mumbai. If he went and there were huge protests, that would be humiliating. But if he didn't arrive in Mumbai, go that way, that would be a loss of face. There was a risk either way. They decided that it was actually riskier not to do it, and they were going to have to be audacious enough to go through it. Actually, it went not too badly. The crowd was thin, but there was a little hostility. People had stayed away. The crowds were not embarrassingly small, so they felt that was relatively successful, the British authorities. And at this stage, Lord Mountbatten, he gave these non-cooperators short shrift, said they were filthy non-cooperators, although over time he was to change his mind and gradually develop more empathy for the Indian nationalist position. So he married in his 20s Edwina. He had 2 daughters with her. You might have seen that film, Mountbatten, the Last Viceroy. I watched that when I was 6. It first whetted my appetite for the history of South Asia, and made me become absolutely fascinated by Lord Mountbatten of Burma. And in that, the 2 daughters are rolled into one. Okay, but in reality, there are 2 of them. And I think one of them is still alive. So that was that. So in many ways, a happy marriage, but an open marriage. As he later commented, he and his wife spent most of their time, their marriage, getting in and out of other people's beds. There's even some suggestion that he was bisexual. There's certainly a good friend of Fruity Metcalf, a well-known establishment homosexual of the 1930s. So he was a very broad-minded sort of person, and perhaps his wife was a demi-mondaine, and he was much the same, quite go-ahead in his sartorial tastes, his cultural tastes, into jazz and nightclubs, and not so much into country house weekends, hunting, shooting and fishing and so on. He could do a bit of that, but he was more an urbanite, more of a cosmopolitan person than someone who was of the bucolic kind and inward-looking. So at the beginning of the First World War, his father had been pressurized into resigning from the Royal Navy because of his German birth. He wasn't trusted. Would he feel a conflict of loyalties? Might he be passing information to the Germans? And great suspicion fell on them. And that's why they anglicized their name from Battenberg to Mountbatten. Obviously, Berg just meaning mountain in German, which is why calling it Mount makes sense. You could have said Batten Mount, but they felt it was a better English to be Mountbatten. So there we were. Anyway, this Lord Louis Mountbatten behind me, he didn't inherit the title, the Marquis of Milford Haven, his elder brother did. Obviously, these heritable titles always go to the elder son. So Lord Mountbatten of Burma, he continued to have a distinguished naval career, serving at various posts in the Second World War, and eventually was Supreme Allied Commander in South Asia. So he recognized that socialists and nationalists represented the future of South Asia, and the only thing was to make an accommodation with them. So he was a bit more forward-thinking than some of his confrères, some people of his social milieu. They were rather living in the past. People like Churchill, who just didn't accept that the writing was on the wall for the British Empire and simply had to face facts and move on. So he was Chief of Combined Operations in South Asia, spent some time in Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, Kandy, Supreme Allied Commander in South Asia, and that was that. He landed at Singapore just after the Japanese surrender, and obviously British colonial authority was restored there. So then he came back to the United Kingdom. He was here in London, and he was on the active list, but there was no sort of naval command for him at that time. And then what was to happen with India? Well, there would be the Stafford Cripps mission in 1943 when the Congress Party, that's the independence movement in India, had been promised that the UK would effect independence as soon as practicable after the end of the First World War. And then that was repeated after the end of the Second World War, right at the end of the war, that within 3 years of the Japanese surrender, independence would become a reality. And Congress weren't quite sure if they could trust the British Raj to fulfill this pledge. There was also the Muslim League. Remember, India back in those days it consisted of Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. So India was up to 30% Muslim. Most of the other rest were Hindus, a few Sikhs, Christians, Buddhists and so forth. So the Muslim League were agitating for the partition of India, for a new country called Pakistan to be created, meaning land of the pure in Urdu. Okay, it's meant to be, like an acronym P for Punjabis, A for Afghans. They're really talking about people from Baluchistan and the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, let me see, K for Kashmiris, S for Sindhis and so forth. So that was that. Was India to be partitioned or not? So Lord Wavell, formerly commander of the Indian Army, he was Viceroy out there, and obviously it was a very difficult situation. Law and order was close to breaking down. There was a lot of inter-communal violence at the time. And then, so February 1947, Mountbatten was asked, would he be willing to go out to India to become Viceroy, to try to expedite independence as soon as possible. And so only when he was guaranteed various things like a plane, he wasn't going to go all the way by ship, did he get it, and he was about to put the foot down and refuse to go because it would seem to be a thankless task. It was very difficult to carry this off successfully. I mean, everything could go wrong. And other things, he must have plenipotentiary powers. He was not going to have to refer every tiny decision back to the cabinet in London. Clement Attlee, a Labour man, was Prime Minister at the time. Another thing, Winston Churchill was still leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party, leader of the opposition. And an India bill was going to have to be passed, recognising Indian independence. And the Conservatives in the House of Lords had the legal power to delay this for up to 2 years at the time. And the one thing everybody concurred about was that this ought to be done forthwith, and a 2-year delay could be cataclysmic. So he went to see Churchill, who harumphed and grumpily assented, okay, he'll follow the Salisbury Convention. That was after the Marquis of Salisbury. If something's in the manifesto of a political party, then the House of Lords will not delay it. Okay, the Labour government in their manifesto, 1945 election, said, if elected, we will grant India independence as soon as we can. So the Tory peers were going to allow that through. So that was that. So he went out to India with his wife, Edwina. She was Viceroy. And that was that. Had these getting to know you sessions with Jawaharlal Nehru. So his wife, Edwina, and Pandit Nehru got along famously well. Nehru was a widower at the time. He's obviously the father of Indira Gandhi, subsequent Prime Minister, the grandfather of Rajiv Gandhi, who was also Prime Minister. Both his daughter and grandson were assassinated. And then Rahul Gandhi, his great-grandson, is currently leader of the Congress Party. And indeed, Nehru's father, Motilal Nehru, had led the party once before. So 5 generations have led the party. And actually 6 members, Sonia Gandhi, as in the widow of Rahul Gandhi, she was briefly led the party but chose not to be PM. But anyway, back to what's his name? There's a very tall man, always immaculately turned out, always lean, zealously guarded his waistline. And I suppose he looked every inch the Viceroy in that sense. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was the leader of the Muslim League, and he did not warm to this gentleman. He thought that he was false, and he didn't like this bonhomous attitude. He wanted to be businesslike. We don't actually have to pretend to be chummy here. We just got to get something done. And but on his part, Mountbatten felt that Jinnah was desiccated, aloof, distant, cold, all the rest of it, too calculating, and that was that. And he prepared his one-liners too carefully and came out with them even though they didn't quite work. But that was that. So he had to meet various other people like Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, this barrister who was a senior figure in the Congress Party, later first Home Minister of India, Home Minister we called Home Secretary in the UK. And leading Baldev Singh on behalf of the Sikhs, and various other luminaries. Well, Liaquat Ali Khan, who was not Nehru's, forgive me, Jinnah's number 2 in the Muslim League. But anyway, the idea was that there would be independence by June 1948, and law and order was breaking down. Partition was agreed upon. The Congress Party reluctantly voted for it. They were loath to do this because they want to preserve the unity of India, but if they didn't, they thought it might be more disastrous. Would independence be delayed indefinitely? Would there be greater scale bloodshed and so on? And Mountbatten really didn't want to see India divided. He felt that Indian unity was one of Britain's major achievements. Obviously, when the East India Company was founded in 1600, India was somewhat united. The Mughal Empire was quite strong. It was gradually falling apart, and that's why in the mid-18th century, the British East India Company began to acquire dominion over greater and greater sections of the country, gradually putting it back together. Obviously, India, with such a long history, has been united and divided several times over its history. Its borders have waxed and waned like the frontiers of most other nation states. It's sometimes taken in part of Afghanistan. Sometimes some areas of modern-day India were not part of India, and blah, blah, blah. So that would be undoing all this good work as he saw it. But anyway, Jinnah was adamant he must have it. He must have Pakistan. And there was no doubt there was actually fervent feeling on his side. It was very surprising, almost at the last minute, well, that it happened. Some people thought that it wasn't actually going to happen. But then Sir Cyril Radcliffe, this judge, was brought out to draw the borders before. He'd never been to South Asia in his life. He was a fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, this absolutely stellar college for graduate students only. So he had to draw it up in complete secrecy. And the judges on both sides were put forward claims which he felt were so outrageous he had to do all the work himself, because he had to take account of the religious composition of a district, but then also where the canals are and the headwaters and where the railway lines are. So sometimes people found themselves on the wrong side of the border, even though everyone in their village was Muslim, might be in India, something like that, because they were part of a railway line that connected to what was going to stay as India. So it was difficult to manage geographical contiguity as well as making it religiously coherent. Not all Muslims were for the Muslim League. A few of them were in Congress. And I even met a man who told me how his grandparents were perhaps the only Punjabi Muslims to move east at the time. They didn't want to be in Pakistan, they wanted to be in India. Anyway, so there's a lot of interreligious violence. I'm not suggesting all Muslims hated all Sikhs or Hindus or vice versa, but there were certainly a considerable number who did. And the UK government had even considered Operation Madhouse of simply withdrawing, not formally granting independence, withdrawing the British civilians and military personnel and just leaving the Indians to sort it out for themselves. But in the end, that didn't happen. So it was decided that 14th of August would be Independence Day. He suddenly decided that he'd just prepone the whole thing, bring it forward by 10 months. but some people like Andrew Roberts, the historian, says that was very bad news. It created a sense of panic. It was done too fast. But perhaps the UK couldn't hold it together much longer. The UK was under severe financial pressure, hugely in debt to the United States. There were a lot of mopping up conflicts after the Second World War, just like after the First World War. For example, in Palestine, where the UK was very keen to quit the place, Palestine and Israel as it now is. And the Cold War was already in the offing. But 14th of August was an impropitious date, according to Hindu numerology. Something to do with is it the moon or the stars? So it had to be 15th for India, 14th for Pakistan. That was that. So he offered to be first Governor General of Pakistan, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah saying no, thank you. He was Qaid-e-Azam, as in the great leader. In Urdu. He wanted to be that, as well as President of the Constituent Assembly, as in that's Parliament, really. So Qaid-e-Azam was both effectively head of state and head of government. Actually, King George VI was who would be an emperor of India. At Indian independence, he assumed the title King of India and King of Pakistan, although these actually weren't formally conferred upon him. So, in a sense, Jinnah was the understudy of George VI, who never set foot in South Asia. And then what was the next thing? There's obviously Nehru's famous speech, which I shan't repeat. At the stroke of the midnight hour, as the world sleeps, India awakes to life and freedom. Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. I shan't tell you the whole thing. But anyway, so that was Indian independence, and Mountbatten was the first Governor General, as in representing the monarch George VI. George VI was keen that India would say the Commonwealth not become a republic, and these things were thought to be incompatible, being a republic and being in the Commonwealth. Remember, in Ireland, we didn't proclaim a republic until 1949. And we left the Commonwealth at that point. Thereafter, the Commonwealth adjusted and said, if you're a republic, you can remain in the Commonwealth. The monarch doesn't have to be your head of state. That was that. They were hailed by cheering crowds, Mountbatten and Nehru, who got along so famously, and led to rumours that Nehru was having an affair with Lord Mountbatten's wife, with Lady Edwina Mountbatten. Others say that's not true. Nehru's sister said, well, actually, he was impotent at the time, and indeed letters have been read by Pamela Hicks, as in Lord Mountbatten's daughter, years later. Letters between Nehru and Lady Mountbatten for the rest of their lives, and she said, well, there's nothing in them to indicate that there was any impropriety there. So that's that. It's a nice rumour, scotched. I don't think it would reflect discredit on either of them if that were true. And so some Pakistanis have this conspiracy theory, that the Mountbattens were too partial to India because Nehru was getting a leg over with the Viceroy. I think that's not true. But it makes a very salacious and fun rumour, very exciting to believe. Anyway, so then he stayed on until the following year, when Dr. C. Rajagopalachari became Governor General, and obviously 26th of January 1950, India proclaimed a republic, celebrated as Republic Day, the 20th anniversary of when the Congress Party said, if we don't have Dominion status by 26th of January 1930, then we don't want Dominion status, we want total independence, leaving the British Empire. So that was why it was an apposite day to declare a republic. It's still celebrated with huge parades. Republic Day, that happens to also be Australia Day. So he came back here. He had various positions: Admiral of the Fleet, Commander of whatever Defence Staff, or Chief of Defence Staff. That's it. He served in Malta for a while. When it came to the Suez conflict in 1956, as he later vouchsafed in an interview, he was violently against it. So he was loaded with honours, being made a Knight of the Order of the Garter, being made General Commander of the Order of the Bath, the Order of the Merit, getting the Order of Merit, becoming a General Commander of the Order of the Star of India, a General Commander of the Order of the Indian Empire, General Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, getting the Distinguished Service Order, being made a Fellow of the Royal Society. That's the Royal Society of London for the what is it? The advancement of natural philosophy or something like that. Basically means science, even though he wasn't a scientist. First Sea Lord, so he had all sorts of gongs, but so you'll say, well, really just to his connections, he wasn't that multi-talented. So some people thought he was a bit of a crashing snob. He certainly cared deeply about his status and was always poring over his family tree. If you see that marvellous film, Mountbatten, The Last Viceroy, I can't remember the name of the Scottish actor who plays him, but Ian Richardson in brown face portrays Nehru. These days that would be considered not to be on. He gives a very respectful portrayal of Nehru. But anyway, in that film, it makes it plain that yes, that he was fixated with looking into his forebears. Then the Queen's coronation ceremony in June 1953, he was miffed that he didn't have more of a prominent role. but the Queen ordered, no, this is where you'll ride in the procession. He didn't ride quite as far forward as he wanted to, so he cared very deeply about people kowtowing to him. So his wife, she was involved in some nursing corps, I think it was Queen Alexandra Corps of Nurses, and indeed she was on a trip to Borneo when she died in her sleep in 1960, and she was 59. So she's buried at sea off the coast of Portsmouth. I'm not quite sure why. Why wasn't she buried on land? She wasn't a sailor, and she wasn't on some sort of military operation. So you can see footage of that. And the Indian Navy, not Royal anymore, they sent the ship to be part of her funeral. I don't know, what would you call it, voyage? And obviously her weighted coffin was dropped into the sea. It was just committed to the deep to make sure it sank. And you can see her husband kissing a rose as he drops it in on top of her. So he used to go to Ireland every summer. They had that house in County Sligo, but he was advised not to. In the early 60s, the IRA considered bumping him off, and Rory O'Brada, the leader of the IRA at the time, he vetoed it because there was a standing order number 10. The IRA was not, generally speaking, to kill people in the Republic of Ireland, or only the north. But then 1979, they decided to go ahead and do it. He was such an easy target that the Garda Síochána, that's the police in the Irish Republic, they were around him. There was only so much they could do. But he was warned not to go, but he said, what would they want with an old man like me? I despise extremism of all kinds. He was the sort of person who was for compromise. It would reflect his credit on them to kill this elderly tourist who was completely unarmed. So the IRA, they could have killed him in a way which didn't endanger anyone else. They could have shot him, which obviously would still be a terrible thing to do. But oh no, rather than run the slightest risk of getting caught, they were going to kill him in a way they could be sure was going to kill other civilians, including an Irish boy. And so that's what they did. They were later apprehended and found guilty because even though they were going to kill civilians just to try and increase their chance of getting away with it, they were pretty incompetent and managed to get caught anyway. So hats off to the other people from around Sligo or other parts of Ireland who had the outstanding valour to testify against the IRA, who tried to terrorise them into not doing it. So that's Lord Mountbatten, who was brought back here for a very stately funeral which he designed years before, and Indian troops and Gurkhas marching in procession to Westminster Abbey, and the Queen, they're all got up in mourning, and he was very close to his great-nephew Prince Charles, and Prince Charles reading the lesson, as in from the Bible, and he's buried somewhere down in Portsmouth. I can't remember, because obviously he was a sailor in relation to that. But you should read Eminent Victorians by Andrew Roberts, that right-wing historian who really does a hatchet job on Lord Mountbatten. I suppose it's an elegant character assassination, saying that he was so conceited and he only cared about the glitter of all these medals. He was a very vain man, and he was a failure, and he shouldn't have hastened Indian independence. Okay, it was going to come in just after the Second World War, but they could have done it in a calmer and more prudent manner and all the rest of it. He needed to expose himself and others to danger. He got himself killed, he got those other people killed. He was advised to stay out of Ireland, and he didn't. And you see what happened. Obviously, who was to blame for killing him? The IRA were to blame for killing him, but he shouldn't have made it easy for them. Anyway, Prince Charles, actually only a few months later, proposed to Lord Mountbatten's granddaughter, if I've got that right, and she said no. And it's one of the things, I suppose, which reminded Prince Charles of his own mortality, growing up, hurry up, got to get married soon, which is why, a year later, that's why I proposed to Princess Diana. That's enough about Lord Mountbatten of Burma.